Go. There we go. Right. Yeah. Okay. So, what we're going to talk. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk about inequality. But what I wanted to first do is just go over. I've looked over each one of your proposals. I think you've got some good proposals there. I think you have a reasonable understanding of the information that you've received, and I think each one of you has some pretty good proposals. Some of them are a little bit too broad right now, so we'll want to try to get some of you to get a little bit more focused. In part because you don't have a lot of time. That's one. We don't have a lot of time, and when there's too many things, you can't. It's too much. There's too much to worry about. So that's what we're. So what I want to do first is kind of discuss each one of your topics, and I wanted to go over some of the for Greece, and unfortunately that's what copied to the that's what came out. What I did was I wanted to take the data from the national accounts data, and just go over this. I've got some data going back to 1999. You can go to the 2009. It's the 2009 MADP. So it's on the site. It's on the site for the UN site. If you don't have that, ask me. I'll get that to you again. So what I did was I just downloaded it and looked at it, and and so then I looked at some of the information, downloaded it. I wanted to copy it on there, but I got one very important page though that did copy. Hold this a moment here while I this up. And that is one of the stories is that the Greece borrowed its way. That Greece basically, when they joined the euro, it was an opportunity in order to dramatically expand their borrowing, and this actually shows pretty clearly in the data here. Some of this other stuff I wanted to show, and I want you to take a look at it. You can see you can see the economy looks okay. It seems to be growing, and then when it hits the crisis, it's how severe the economic contraction was. It's quite dramatic. There's no other way to state it other than it was a very dramatic contraction. But here, this is the balance of payments numbers, and you can see this is the net lending, net borrowing of the nation. So that's the balance of payments, and you can see this is in euro, and this would have been Greece joined the euro in 2001. Okay, so but and you'll see 1998. The figure is this is like 1%. I think it's less than 1% of GDP. It's not a big number. That's what this is net national income. The GDP is a bigger number, and unfortunately, it's here somewhere. That's what it is. It's right there. But you'll see that figure. That's quite a small number. Okay, the euro began on January the 1st, 1999. Now, Greece didn't join until 2001. Right? But you can see right away, everyone knew there were 12 countries that joined the euro on January the 1st, 1999. Greece people expected them to join, so the borrowing, the net balance of payments began growing. By the time that Greece officially joined the euro in 2001, the figure is 5 times more. The the balance of payment, the negative balance of payments are 5 times greater than just 3 years earlier. And these are big, for the size of the economy, it's big numbers. Massive, massive borrowing. And so this was like 10%. I think it's about 7 or 8% of GDP and approaching 10% of GDP. But it's huge borrowing that was that the country was doing, and the problem was that it wasn't going towards productive activity. It appears that most of it just went for consumption. Some of it is Greece did have they had the Olympics in 2000 and I'm trying to think. When did, let's see, Summer Olympics. 2020, 2016, 2012, 2004. I think it's 2004 that Greece, and it was a financial disaster. You know, for Greece it was a financial disaster. So that's 2004. But so some of that borrowing might have been to finance the. But you can see this figure up to the financial crisis, just huge. Just kept on growing, it got bigger and bigger. This is when the financial crisis hit. So you really can see that story. But I've got the other data, and I want you to take a look at that. We've got Yuki when he comes. There's more missing data, but that's the kind of. This is what the tables I wanted to look at. So I'm going to talk about China. Okay. Now China is the question is what is driving how stable is China? How stable is it's a great question. But it's a very important question because at this point everybody's trying to figure out whether is there going to be an explosion? Is there going to be some kind of what is going to happen there? And it's a great question, and I think it's important to get a handle on what's going on in the Chinese economy. So what I have here, this is actually this was from my lecture last year. I've been planning on. I may do something like that, maybe not. But this was in my lecture. I took my lecture notes from last year. But what I did is the GDP components at constant prices. So what I did, I actually had to create the Chinese data, and we'll have to talk about that because you have to make adjustments. There have to be adjustments made, and I can talk to you how to do that. But if you look, you'll see this is constant constant prices. So this is real. This is real GDP. It's adjusted for changes in prices, and you can see how rapidly. From 2003 to 2014, the overall Chinese economy trend is 3 times in real terms. It's fantastic growth. This is a massive wealth creation that's going on. But the really interesting figure. Well, there's a couple of things. One, you look at government. Government is like 15% of GDP. Let's see, and that's like 14. Government grows slower than government expenditure grows slower. The overall consumption. Look at how consumption. The GDP is almost triple. Consumption just about the same, maybe a little bit lower, a little bit less than overall. But investment increases more than 3 times. And that's the important picture, and that's the question that people have: is the investment in a developing country? Investment is crucial. It's crucial for a country to invest a lot because you have to. When a country is developing, it has to grow its it has to create infrastructure. Countries that are developing need a lot of capital. And they need to make a lot of investment. So this is what China has done. And when we look at as a component, as the GDP component share of overall GDP, what you see is you'll look at in 2003 the investment was 40% of GDP. Now China's GDP increases almost 3 times. Look at the investment figure. It basically increases up to 2010 47%, and it only declines to 46.4% in 2014. That's a massive figure. That's absolutely massive. Almost 50% of China's GDP in 2010 was generated, and this is 2014, so we're talking quite recently. This is recent stuff. Was investment. They're building railroads, they're building ports, they're building office buildings, housing. Housing is residential investment, is part of investment. All of that. And the question, that's the real question. The question is, because when you make investment, you have to get a return on investment. You spend money, you have to get money. It has to help create wealth. Because if it doesn't, you can invest too much. In fact, that's what happened in the bubble. In Japan's bubble, is that there was too much investment. There was too much, it was investment that wasn't productive. During that period, factories got built, and some of it, they were dismantled almost immediately. They produced very little. That's the question here. Is China producing? Are you using all this investment to create wealth or not? If not, it's going to be a very, very big headache, very big decline. The reality is the debt, the amount of the total debt in China is probably manageable. The corporate debt appears high. China's companies appear to have a lot of debt, which is actually the situation in Japan at the end of the bubble. That Japanese corporations had too much debt. So if there's any problem with debt in China, it's corporate debt. But here, corporate debt might be a problem, but there it's investment. That's the big question. So that's China. Let's see. Now I want to talk about Australia, and I do have one sheet. And one of your questions is an interesting question. What would happen with the is the Australian economy if it was a bigger country? I mean, the interesting thing about whether it had more population. I mean, Australia's population is quite small. It's only about a quarter. It's, let's see, what is about 27, 28 million. It's not very big. You know, it's less than the 4 prefectures of Tokyo, Kanagawa, Chiba, and Saitama. So less population in the whole gigantic country. So it's really an empty country. But it's also a country that it's the driest continent in the world. Most of it, the huge areas have very little water. It's desert. It's a massive desert. And there's only around the coast is really where people can live. Most of the interior is very little of it is actually inhabitable by large numbers of people. There's no reason for lots of people to live in the interior of Australia. So actually, there's really a relatively small area that really can support people. I mean, you have water. You have to worry about water. Australia can grow a lot of food. It has the ability to grow a lot of food. But one of the issues is, one of the interesting things is that when you look, this is the value added by industries at constant prices. So this tells you each of the industries, and you can look at the overall gross domestic product for Australia. This is for 2004 to 2013. This manufacturing, mining, and quarrying, this figure, and in fact you have manufacturing here, and right here shows you mining. Sorry, and you'll be able to see that. It's massive. Because Australia is a small country, it's the interesting thing about Australia, and I was thinking about this, is that the mining sector is such a big part of the economy. in Australia. There's lots of jobs for working class people. Working class people, every working person with a reasonable level of skills can work in the mining sector. Manufacturing is not very big. The reason is that Australia is too far away from global markets. You have these are the most isolated. These are basically the most isolated major cities in the world. You take a city like Perth, for example, in Western Australia, most isolated city over 1 million on the planet. Absolutely isolated, and it's also focused on mining. It's mining. So mining is really a very huge part. It's as big as the financial sector, bigger than the information communication. It's a huge sector. So if it was a bigger country, that would probably it wouldn't be any bigger. It just, they're digging up as much of Australia as, digging up as much dirt as they can and shipping it to other countries. In fact, a huge coal mine is just opening. That's being the investment has actually come from an Indian company, and it's probably going to play a very important role in supplying India's needs for coal in order to expand its its production of electricity. So this is actually the connect. So there's these connections. Massive coal mine in Queensland that's going to open quite soon. So anyway, that's really an important part of that picture. Then finally, petroleum. And I wanted to, and the idea is there in terms of pattern of trade, does petroleum tend to be shipped locally? You've noticed on the maps that you can see that there's your hypothesis is that it tends to be local. That's an interesting question, and so what I wanted to do, because to some degree that's true, and some degree it's not. Yeah. And so here's one way, and you've gotten used to, I think you're kind of focused on using the map, so I think that's it's certainly a very good way to learn. So, and I think you've made a lot of use of that. So what I've done here is I've taken from Mexico, export, I just picked the country. Mexico is an important oil producer. And so what I wanted to see was, for not over the whole world, but I did this morning, so so it's something that I could put together fairly quickly. Well, what I did was I took, and the brighter the yellow means this is a map that shows the per person import of petroleum. That's a 2-digit 27. So 2-digit 27 from Mexico in 2015. So and this is using the Mexican. This is what Mexico reports. So Mexico's shipping of their exports of petroleum. And so the brightest is actually the brightest is actually Belize and Panama. This is the U.S. is so big that yellow kind of I don't know if this is the right color, but these are actually a little bit brighter, and these are the largest. They're about per person about $60 a person, which in 2015 would like roughly a barrel of oil per person from Mexico. So that's these kind of, the U.S. is a little bit less, but a lot. The U.S. imports a lot of oil. Now some of that maybe that goes right back into this oil that comes from Mexico most of this comes from the Gulf of Mexico, and it's oil with a high wax and sulfur content, and it's shipped to the Gulf Coast refineries in Texas and Louisiana, because those refineries are built to produce that oil, or to refine that oil. So some of that actually goes back to Mexico. As it might be the gasoline might be exported to Mexico. So that might be part of that trade. Anyway, that may not be what you're interested in, but that's some of the kind of detail. You'll look here though, these white, some of these are really light, almost zero, but not quite. Pretty much zero. Canada's got lots of petroleum. There's no reason we can't. Cuba's zero. But Dominican Republic is imports, but not Haiti, not Cuba. Jamaica a bit, but almost zero in Guatemala, almost zero. Honduras, El Salvador, almost zero. So that's interesting. So the neighbors, immediate neighbors, and I don't, one of the things you want to do is look and see, do they produce oil? I know Canada does. Costa Rica, I don't, probably not. So it's Panama, the big importer. Okay, Panama's a big importer. So this kind of shows there's some of what it supports some of that. Some of your hypothesis supports. And what you want to look and see, well, what's the individual, if you say, look at a country, look at its exports, what's the individual factor? Like Canada, it has a lot of oil. Yeah, so that's, what's the individual situation? Then we have South America, and it's not very far. But Brazil, very little, but some. Colombia, some. That's Colombia, Brazil. Everything else, pretty much zero. Venezuela, of course, produces a lot of oil. It's making a lot of problems too, but it produces a lot of oil. These countries, but pretty much everything else, they don't import any oil. Now some of this, like Ecuador, has petroleum. So there's some petroleum, but they certainly don't import from Brazil. Has some petroleum. So that's interesting. Now Asia, you can see again very little, except Korea quite a bit per person. South Korea a fair amount of oil, and this is because South Korea, as Japan, just doesn't have any zero. And of course, if you're following the methane hydrate, this country is making a lot of effort to figure out how to mine methane hydrate and basically to use it to produce natural gas. And I don't know if you're interested in this topic. Now Japan is going to be working with some other researchers in other countries that are trying to get methane hydrate. Do you know what that is? Are you familiar with methane hydrate? Look this up. I think it's if you're interested in the energy topic, this is an important methane hydrate. This is a very interesting topic. The methane hydrate is a gas, okay, and you can use it. It's a gas, and it exists on the ocean floor. On the ocean floor, it's cold and it actually precipitates and it becomes like a solid. It's like it's like a snow. It's like a solid. And so people and Japan actually has a lot of it. There's a lot of methane hydrate that especially off the coast right here. Along the coast right there. There's a lot of methane hydrate. And there's been a lot of research that's been going on to try to get it. It's a very interesting, and now Japan is going to be working with other countries to try to figure out how to do this. But they're having problems. But you can see Japan as well definitely imports oil from Mexico. But maybe a little bit in India. Everywhere else zero, pretty much zero in Asia. But what's interesting, you also, Japan signed a free trade agreement with Mexico. I think part of that's definitely influenced oil. It's an effort for Japan. When you do research, you will want to look and see Japan gets most of its oil from the Persian Gulf. Not a stable place. Not a stable place. And also, Qatar, as we've talked about, Qatar, it's a big, and that situation is not getting resolved yet. In fact, with Qatar, the helium, the world's production of helium is being threatened by this situation in Qatar. And researchers that need helium are beginning to cut back their research around the world because the supply of helium is being cut off by this crisis in Qatar. So these are some interesting things going on. This is Europe, and this is really interesting. I didn't expect this at all. That's almost one of the highest in the world, this Spain. Now, what's interesting about this? Can you see any interesting pattern here? Does anything strike as the countries that are? What is the characteristic of four? There's 5 countries. What characteristic do 4 of those countries have that's similar?
This country occupied Mexico. No, Spain.
Sorry?
This country occupied Mexico.
Well, that's that's right. That's probably colonial history. Yeah, colonial history. That's certainly.
Yeah.
But Spain, yes, and of course Spanish.
Yeah.
Spanish, Portuguese, Italian. These are all related languages.
Yeah.
So these countries all have languages that are related to Spanish. So if there's anybody in Europe, and Brazil of course speaks Portuguese, but these are similar languages. So and France of course French is a Latin. These are all Latin languages related to Latin, as is Spanish. So it's interesting that the countries that are buying, some of this has to do with a cultural tie, I suspect, because no other, except for the Netherlands, no place else, and they could buy a lot. There's lots of oil here. There's lots of it, but they're buying it from Mexico. They're importing as much, pretty much more than the U.S. per person, all the way across the Atlantic. Interesting. So that's the kind of. So sometimes you see these patterns, and I think it has to do with some of cultural. So that's kind of an overview. So start working. I think you've got some nice topics. For some of you want to focus in on that a bit. But I think you've got all of you have some good solid direction. I think you have some good ideas of what you want to do. You're asking some good questions. So let's get on. We're probably, I think we'll want to have everything done in about 4 weeks. So I think from every week now, I think we'll want to be in close contact. Let me know where your progress. You can take some of these ideas. That's fine. I'm happy to do that. Show me what you're doing. There's only four of you, so we'll be able to interact quite closely. So we can look forward to that. At any rate, now we're going to talk about inequality. And inequality, the big inequality the most important inequality that we're concerned with as economists is income. Income inequality. And income inequality, we're talking about income inequality within nations. Of course, we can talk around the world as well. But what we're interested in here is measuring inequality within countries. And there's a measurement that's designed to do that. It's called the Gini coefficient. the Gini coefficient, named after an Italian economist of the early 20th century. And basically, it's a measurement of statistical dispersion that's used to measure the degree of income dispersion in a population. And it measures the inequality in a frequency distribution. So measurement of 0 indicates a perfectly equal distribution, so that if it's the cumulative share from lowest to highest income, and so if everyone has the same income, everyone's along this line, this line here. The further away from that, but then this curve is called the Lorenz curve. So that what that means is that if a lot of people have very little income, this is income level. I think I've got that. Let's see. No, this is income. This is income, and this is the share. So if lots of people have little income, that curve is going to go out more along here. It ends up here. It always ends up here, and it always starts here. So the question is how far down does it go? The further down it goes, the bigger the area of A is, that's more inequality. So it's a real simple measurement, but it's easy to, if you know, what you need to know the distribution. So you need to know the distribution of income across the population. But once you know that, you can make this measurement, it gives a number, and you can compare that number across the different countries to get a sense of the degree of inequality in countries. So this is the mathematical formula. As I say, a note here, it's reasonable and meaningful income comparisons across space and time. So time, you can look at over the years or across space between countries. So typically, if you have a coefficient of over 0.5, that's unequal income. And if it's below 0.3 or below, that's considered to be relatively equal. And that's just and that's a general idea. So what we'll do now is we're going to look at individual countries. What happened here? Great. Okay. Okay, well. Okay. Well, you can see the shape of Africa. I don't know what happened there. I know there was a map there this morning. So, at any rate, this is Africa. And what you have, and I mentioned at 30, so 0.3. So I basically this is, yeah, right. Okay. Northern Africa. That's Morocco. Morocco's not very high. Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, those are fairly not terribly low, but okay. Then you have some of the and the Western African countries, and the yellow means it's very low. There's only like one measurement. So what I did was I took. So since 1990, what I did was that I took an average where data was available. So I took that, and in order to get an average of inequality during that time. Some of these are but you'll see that a number of these countries have over 50. And so you have a number of African countries, Central African Republic, that is Rwanda, 52. That's Tanzania at 50. I know you could imagine where Tanzania is. Some of the world's most unequal countries are in South Africa. South Africa has some of the most unequal countries. Namibia, 66. Namibia is a country that was colonialized by the Germans. and there's still a substantial white population that's quite dominant. So here's an example, a colonial country, still quite a bit of white domination, and a lot of inequality. It's a more wealthy country overall, and maybe the people that are poorer are not as poor as in other parts of Africa, but there's more income inequality. That's Botswana. Same thing. Botswana is that's a former English colony, and a fair number of white people in that country. South Africa, 63, is one of the top in the world. South Africa, if you know anything about South Africa, it has a substantial white population, about 20%, and they have most of the wealth of the country. That may have changed a little bit in the last 20 years, but it's still quite a lot of inequality. But then you have countries like Zimbabwe, 53, that's Zambia, 51, Angola, 52. Some of these are poorer countries. That's, the least you could imagine that's where those countries are. One that's not here is actually Equatorial Guinea. And I've talked about it because it's probably some of the most unequal income. And that will probably be like 60 or 70 or more. Europe, again, you can use your imagination as to where those countries. This is a good test to see if you know these continents, or these, kind of where these countries are. So if you can imagine that. That's Iceland. That's 29, it's below 30. So you're talking about some of these countries, some of the situation is you have countries that are very homogeneous, very similar people, single ethnic mix, or very most of the people are from a single ethnic mix. So you have very kind of stable societies, and these countries tend to be equal. The Scandinavian countries as well. That's Denmark, 29, again, very, very low. Norway, which of course is rich in oil, so you've got, and it gets dispersed quite fairly. Sweden, 27, it's among the lower countries in the world. Finland, 28. But you'll see most of the European countries, low 30s, really. Britain, 33. Ireland, 35. It's not very. Europe tends to have fairly equal income. Turkey, 43. So you're getting a little bit higher there. Russia, 38. Now, what's interesting here, you have some of these. I think that's Ukraine. Ukraine, 20. I think that's Moldova, 34. That's Belarus, 27. A lot of these countries. This is a legacy. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Where's Poland? And maybe that's Poland. That's either Poland or Belarus. I think that's Germany. No, that's Germany. So that's Poland. That's Poland. These numbers, these former communist countries, have actually increased since the collapse of communism. These had Gini coefficients as low as like 18, 19. Everybody, basically, the incomes were the same across the society in communists, when they were communist governments. The problem was that everybody was equal, but nobody had very much. So everybody was equally poor. So that was the problem. But there was a lot of but they were very equal. So since then, some people have made more money than others. But overall, it's still relatively equal. Although Russia is up to a little bit higher, and it's probably higher. It's probably gone up. But as I say, these numbers are fairly low. I mean, these are the low mid-30s. it's not it's not major inequality, although it has gone up. It has gone up. The Middle East, let's see. I think that's Egypt. Egypt. And boy, there's a lot of missing data. There's a lot of missing data, as well as the missing map. So in this case, there's both a missing map and missing data. So I'm trying to remember here. That is Iran. Iran 43. That's probably Iraq. That might be Oman. I think that's Jordan. I don't think there's data for these countries, the Persian Gulf countries, and Saudi Arabia. And of course here, the Gulf countries have most of the population are imported workers that are low paid from countries like India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, countries like that. So those numbers would be pretty high if they were here. This is the Central Asian country. I think that might be Kazakhstan, 36. That would, I think, Kyrgyzstan. Tajikistan. So anyway, but we'll be able to confirm that when we fix this problem. East Asia. You can see it generally. Again, you have the picture of. Anybody know where Japan is? See if you can, because you do have the other maps. So if you picture that's Japan. That's 31, and it's that's kind of, as I say, 30, 31. That's that kind of boundary where a relatively even, a relatively reasonable distribution of income, not too unequal. It's a little bit higher than 20 years ago. Maybe it was like 28, maybe 28 or 29. It hasn't changed much. It's gone up a little bit more inequality. It's not very high. You can see that in general it's the 30s. Yeah, these are the those Central Asian countries. India. That's India, Sri Lanka 38, India 30. India, just everybody's pretty poor. I mean, that's definitely going to go up. Pakistan, just 32. Nepal. I think that's Thailand. That might be that might be Malaysia, and that might be Thailand. Any rate, that's China. So 39. I think someone asked me about China. I think, yeah, China's, it's not, it's less, its inequality is less, actually. And that's interesting. It's gone up, certainly, but it's not terribly wild. And I would recommend, this data is quite easy to get on the World Bank site. You have that site. So you can get that, the Gini coefficient, and they have numbers going back, some countries going back to the 1950s. Some of it's annual, occasional. There's lots of data. So you'll be able to get a good sense. And I think I have a chart here a little bit later, which will come up. So don't worry. Yeah, this is really interesting. Australia 35, New Zealand 36. That's Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea 48. I think that's Fiji, but there was not much data. 44. That just means there's one data point. That's what what that means. Where the red means that I had enough data to make it that's a reasonable average. North America. What's interesting, U.S. is 41. By world standards, it's pretty high. And what we're going to see a little bit later is, in fact, that's increased. It's increased, and it's increased fairly substantially since. And what's interesting is it's increased. You can see the increase since NAFTA. That's 41, but that's an average over the last 20 years or so, and you'll see it's the Mexico 52. This is the kind of Latin America. A lot of these, there's only a single data point, but you'll see the upper 40s, low 50s. That's, I believe, Haiti. Could be Dominican Republic. 59. That's pretty high. Then you're talking the Central American countries. Panama is 47. That's probably Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador. Could be El Salvador or Guatemala. Any rate, the thing is, all of these are in the 50s. That's a lot of inequality. The Latin American countries are among the world's most unequal, and that's kind of, it creates a lot of social instability. I think it's part of the reason why the Latin American countries have tended to have a lot of social instability, is this high degree, very unequal societies. Canada's very European. And Canada, if you've ever been there, it's much more. It's a much more of a European. It has more of a European feel. Certainly different in the United States. I can tell. It's a big difference. It's there's definitely a difference in culture. I mean, the U.S. is more wide open and more tolerant of inequality. Canada is more European, and the numbers very similar to what you'll see in terms of income distribution if you go back to the European countries. And we'll get this fixed. You'll be able to see the real map. So, but the European, that's very similar. It's very similar to to most of the European countries. South America, some very, very unequal. This is, in terms of a region, it's probably some of the most unequal societies in the world. Now, we mentioned South Africa, the Southern Africa is, and then that's the white and the colonial white and black. That's the situation there. Here, a lot of this, not to some degree, it's the people that are descendants of the Spanish colonialists, and those people tend to be wealthier. They tend to be the wealthy people in the societies, and that's true for many of these societies. That's from Mexico to Brazil. That's Paraguay, Bolivia. Many of these have the Native Americans, the Native Americans, descendants of those people tend to be much poorer, and the people that are descendants of the Spanish, and it's kind of the more European, the more the people are of European descent, as opposed to. And then there's mix, of course. There's the mestizo, the native that are pure native, and then people that are pure European ancestry. And there's definitely an income. And this distribution, this has really been in place for 500 years. This is really 500 years of history here that's reflected in these numbers. This is Chile and Argentina. Now what's interesting, there's Brazil, which the difference, these are a little bit lower. And this is Venezuela. So one of the interesting things about Venezuela is we know about all the problems and it's just every day. No, it's really, the country is falling apart. There was another incident, supporters of the government invaded the National Assembly, and there were members of the opposition, of the members of parliament that were attacked in the parliament today. So it's really, it's ugly. And what's going on there is ugly. But what's interesting, it's one of the most equal countries. And one of the interesting things about it, it's relatively equal, and it was and part of this, of course, may have been when Hugo Chavez became president, but it's more equal. and I think it was more equal. So it's fascinating that you've had all of this social conflict in a country that actually had more equality than other Latin American countries. It's very interesting. But these numbers are a little lower. One of the reasons is that these are mostly European descent. I don't know if you're aware of that, but this is Argentina. I don't think we have I don't think must not be a number for Uruguay, I think. This should be Paraguay. That should be Argentina. Argentina is German and Italian. It's very Western European. Chile is mostly Spanish descent. It's very little native. Very little native, and that probably explains that the societies are more equal. Brazil is very mixed. Brazil is a lot of African people of African descent, Black African descent, European, and native. So that's part of the explanation there. So that's part of there's always a lot of history. So you go back, you see that there. You'll go to the Eastern European countries, communist countries, Western European that has a lot of these disparities do tell us something about the culture, the history, the societies. There's a lot of that, and so that's what makes studying inequality, and I think it's an interesting topic in economics, because it's where, as an economist, sometimes we may not think a lot about history and culture and sociology, society, but when you talk about inequality, that's when, as economists, we have to start thinking about that. So that makes that interesting. So at any rate, this is Brazil. And what I did was I put together a few countries where and this is a great data set from the World Bank. It's a data set from the World Bank that's put together by this economist, Branko Milanovic, and I'll be talking about his work in a few minutes. He's a specialist on inequality. He's done a lot of very interesting work. And at the World Bank, and has put together these data sets so it's easy for us to take a look at this. Brazil, you can see these early 1980s, during the 1980s, 64, it hit 64 in the early 1990s. This was under military government, by the way. The military took over, I think it was 1984. I think it was in 1984. I'll have to check that. But this was under military government, and that's severe inequality. I mean, that's really unequal. Now, one of the things, as Brazil has grown, and now the data was only, as of last year, was only available in 2009 for Brazil. You can see the general trend downward. There's missing data. There's data points that are missing. But there's a general downward trend, but still 54. I think the average is 58, and that 58 is an average. So I took an average, so that's like the average here. But it's trending down, and I think part of what's, if you're following what's going on in that country, I think the current president might end up being impeached. The last president was impeached. The people are going to jail. People that formerly would have just run the country and stolen all the money are now going to jail. So these are actually good developments, that the society is changing. And actually we're seeing that around the world. I mean, there's a lot of very positive changes that are going on, and this, I think, so it'll be interesting to see. The society is becoming more equal. People are getting tired of the nonsense, and people want change. They want change. So we are seeing that. China. I mentioned it was 41 was the, so one of the things that, and this is an interesting question, because of course, this is early, it goes back to 1981, this data. And it was below 30. And this would have been during, and probably during the, before 1978, under Mao, under Mao Zedong, that the probably would have been somewhere in here. But again, staggeringly poor country back in the 1970s. So this is early on in the reforms. It doesn't really take, it starts in the early this is the early 1990s. This is when China begins to take off, is the early 1990s. You know, a steady upward climb. So definitely there's more inequality. It has increased. This was one, there was only data to 2005. It's kind of old data. So that's, I'll have to check. I think you want to check, this is the site. You want to check that to see if there's any update. There may not be. You know, so it's 10-year-old data. So we, you know, at least when I put this, last year I put this together. And that was the most recent data. And that's a problem, is it's hard to, and we don't know, that was just 1 year. So it might be. It might be, if there's anything more recent, it might be up here somewhere. And that's a lot of inequality. I mean, 50 is pretty high. So I know I commented, you know, it looks, we don't really know, or that it was lower, but really that's kind of an average, and maybe it is a bit high. And so maybe that is, you know, that it could be a problem. So that's, we'll have to, you know, look that up. Go to that site and see if they've been able to update at the World Bank, and maybe look around and see if you can find anything else in terms of measuring the Gini coefficient for China. Poland is a very interesting example, and I picked Poland because it's this is a communist era. It's an example of a country during the communist era, the relative equality. It was 1982. It's 20. It's like 21. It's very low. But what's interesting is that this was the Gdansk at the workers' revolt at the Gdansk steel factory that was led by the man who eventually would become president, Lech Walesa. It was in 1979, and very equal society. But as I say, it was equal and everybody was poor, and people had enough. They really had enough. Now you'll see right all through here, it's pretty steady. I think that's kind of a blip in the data. And it's annual data too. A lot of countries, a lot of missing data, but Poland had data for every year. But you'll see it's 1991. This is 1991 is when there were elections that were held. This is fascinating because I remember it very well. They had elections. The communist government decided to have elections, and they allowed the opposition to run, and they thought they were going to win. They were confident. They felt that there was enough social unrest that they felt they needed to have an election, but they thought they would win. And there were 100 seats at stake. And you know how many seats the communists won of those 100? 0. And it was a shock, or at least for people like myself. At the time, I was a graduate student, and I knew someone that was, there was someone in our department that was from Poland, and he wasn't surprised. He wasn't surprised. The communists lost every seat, and basically the government collapsed within a year. So Poland then moved from being a communist country, and so that's that increase. Still not dramatic, but certainly that's that change. Some people started making money, other people were stuck. So that's that's very typical of what's happened in communist, formerly communist countries, in terms of the change in income distribution after the collapse of communism. Here's the United States, and this is really, really interesting. And the U.S. has great data that goes back all the way, I think even to the 1950s. It's one of the best data sets on inequality in the world, and at least at the time was 2011. What's fascinating here is that you have, in the 1960s, by European standards, a little bit high, but still it was like 38, 37, 38, right, 30, right around 38, right in there throughout the 60s, early 1970s, in fact, well into the 1970s. And 1979, 1980, it's still 38. Here's when Ronald Reagan was elected President of the United States in 1980. There were some tax cuts that especially reduced taxes on the wealthy, and it had some impact. Not much though, some slow impact. This was probably the effect of the tax cuts. But even in the by 1990, okay, it's at about 41, 40. It's growing up, growing. The United States is becoming more unequal society. Well, what happens? That's 1992. Let's see, 1991. This is 1991, right here. What happened in 1992? 1992 was NAFTA. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, went into effect in late 1992. And what's interesting is that the number immediately jumps. It's very, very clear that NAFTA had a very big, that's a big increase. That's like just a couple of years. That means a lot of people started making a lot less, and some people started making a lot more. A lot of people started making a lot less money. And you can see it kind of up and down, but it's trending up. There's a slow upward trend. By 2011, 48. Remember I said Mexico is 52? It's getting close to Mexico. It's getting close to Latin American. This is Latin American kind of inequality. You know, so part of it is actually now the U.S. has a lot of Latin Americans. And I don't know. I can't say that that's not causing it, but the influx of people from Mexico, Central America, has also taken place in that. So you've had that huge influx of many illegals, many people that are illegal, but huge influx of low-wage labor. At the same time, the free trade agreement, which made Mexico an attractive place to invest in and move jobs to, and to export back to the United States. This inequality, dramatic increase. I think there's no question. This is an example of the effect of free trade. There's a lot of positive things with free trade. We'll see that on a global level in just a moment. But there's the negative. The negative is increased inequality. That increased global trade does increase inequality because there's losers. For example, if the agricultural sector in this country were just overnight opened up, there would be a significant increase in inequality. If you've traveled around this country, you can know all the places, all the small towns, all the smaller cities, let's say like an Aomori, most of Hokkaido, places in Shikoku, Kyushu. There'd be a lot, the inequality would go up fast. So that's a problem. Problem is that you've got the country needs to open up its agricultural market. These places need to and they need to figure out a way to increase their income, but you would have there's a potential big social impact, and that's the problem. The United States is less concerned about the social impact of increasing inequality, or at least it has been, and I would say that this has a lot to do, this increase has had a lot to do with the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States. And whatever you think about Donald Trump, and some people, he's either loved or hated. Some people think he's an idiot, and some people think he's a genius. Personally, I think he's both an idiot and a genius. So that's, this is the kind of thing that leads to the election of brings Donald Trump's, that's creating that kind of social instability. And I actually, on that, I was going to mention, although we're seeing, this is a global phenomenon, and I think, let me just check, see if the Brexit, no, we'll go over that in a minute. In fact, I will talk about that, because I'll talk about Brexit in just a moment. And when I did this last year, was when I had this class last year, the Brexit vote happened right in the middle. I think like right in the middle of the, in fact, almost this week. It was like this, as I was preparing for the lecture, the Brexit vote happened. And so it was like perfect timing for the subject. But this is the UK, and you can see here it goes back to 61. This is really equal society, as I say, below 30. And this is where you had very strong labor unions, very quite a lot of equality. Labor government, there were a lot of labor governments. This was, the problem was that there was also the country was experiencing decline. So the UK was experiencing decline. What happens in 1984 was the election of Margaret Thatcher, was elected as Prime Minister in 1984. The Conservatives come to power. They do reforms for the economy. The economy grows, but only certain people benefit. So it jumps up to this level, slowly kind of increase. This goes to 2010, but it's certainly, if anything, again, but look at the numbers are lower, 38. And what's interesting is that where you have the US 48, that's a big difference. Donald Trump gets elected, it took the US to 48 for people to get angry enough to elect a Donald Trump. I would say that 2010, you're probably still somewhere in here, in 2016. So by US standards, and if you go back to the US 38, let's see, that goes back, oops. Yeah, 38, we're talking about back in the 1960s. The 1960s. Where Britain is, oh no. Right, okay. Okay. All right. Boy, I don't know why I did that. Sometimes it does that, I don't. Well, I mean, it's easy. I just have to repaste the map in there. At any rate, back to Britain. I wanted to show that this is the for Brexit, and the map. You'll see the map. What I wanted to show was that the thing about Brexit. One, when that vote happened a year ago, it was completely unexpected. if you go back, I remember I watched the returns live, and people just did not. The people, everybody, I thought that it would fail. I thought that they would vote to remain. I thought it'd be maybe 52-48. The people just wouldn't do it. People wouldn't do it. What happened was when you look, and when you do look at the map, and you'll get a chance to do that, I'll get this fixed. The thing that's very interesting is that the urban centers, you look at the urban, this is a map it's some of the red is for leave, the blue, I believe the blue is for remain. And you'll, like central London, very high support for remain. It's like 70-80%. The center cities like Manchester, Birmingham, even Liverpool, the central cities, cities like university city like Cambridge, Oxford, especially Cambridge, very strong remain, very strong, 70-80%. Then when you looked at places, working class, the working class places, and the poor, the places that were especially in the north, you look up, let's see this map, look up here. Outside of the urban centers in the north, very heavily leave. People these were people, once stable, prosperous, middle class people that have now become poor. And they voted this very heavily. So there was a very social element to it. And so what I did was I did a statistical analysis, which is here. I did a statistical analysis to see what was driving the difference. And you had the vote. The interesting thing about the vote was very easy, and a great thing about the internet is that this is a great era to become an analyst, because there's so much data. You can get it so easily at such a low cost, and you can do such interesting. You can do interesting work that 20, 30. When I was in graduate school, would be like a PhD thesis, or certainly a master's thesis. And now you can do it in a few hours. Just grab the data, put it in, and do run the numbers in a couple of hours, and you can do something. That's the difference. But so what I did was I was able to get on each of the districts, the municipalities where the vote took place, and I was able to get data, socioeconomic data from the census that was exactly with those areas, the same area. So I was able to exactly match the Brexit vote with the socioeconomic and locational data, and I did this for England and Wales. I didn't do Scotland. Scotland voted to remain, but Scotland has a different thing going on. Scotland kind of is kind of almost like a separate country anyway. So I took Scotland and Northern Ireland out. So what I did was I took these were coefficients. I don't need to worry about that. But this was the T-score. And what I did, professional, means I was able to take a professional class, and I was able to take for the percentage of professional, and that was managers. So managers and other professionals, and the percentage of professionals, and a percentage, and this was the vote to leave. So a percentage increase in professional had a 1.2% decrease in the vote to leave, which was even, in other words, the increase was greater. It was greater than the percentage of professionals. And the reason is that a professional is married, even if the spouse doesn't doesn't work, well, they vote. That means they voted as well with. So minus 1.2%, extremely very high T-score, very strong relationship. This was the strongest relationship. In other words, it was managers wanted to stay. The people that were benefiting from the EU wanted to stay. The people that were not wanted to said, we're not getting a good deal, we want out. Very, very stark difference. A little bit for black, and that's some of around London, and then so some of that might be just London. It's significant, but I'm not sure that that's really important. Wales did vote more. I looked at Wales. Young people did vote to stay. And that's the thing, young people that tended to be living in cities, so young people in cities that were part of the newer economy, which young people are going to tend to be, voted to remain. So this is the kind of tension. It kind of tells us the tension. And the reason why I mentioned this is really has to do with inequality. We're talking about inequality. The inequality that's come from globalization, trade, the benefits from globalization have been unevenly distributed. And as I say, that is leading to, that led certainly to this Brexit vote. It certainly led to the election of Donald Trump. I think to some degree, you just had the presidential election, Macron, that was elected. He's kind of a centrist, but he clearly wants to change society. That's clear. The people threw out the old order. The absolute vote to throw out the old order. And what's interesting, it's interesting to see to what degree that connection. But if any of you, has anybody looked at the election results from last Sunday? Have you taken a close look at the results? They're very interesting. They're very interesting. There's two, of course, Koike's party won big. One of the things, if you look, one of the things when you look at by the districts, which are the Xi and Machi areas, that the Koike's party was at the top or first in almost every district. If you had do you know what the term first past the post? I'll write this out on the board, because this is the system that we, in both Britain and the US, is called first past the post. It's a reference to horse racing. The horse that comes in first wins the race. Everybody else is second. In the US and Britain, if you're first, you win. Second place gets nothing. We have for our House of Representatives is first past the post. Britain is first past the post. Japan has a very different system, which tends to allow, and the idea is to allow smaller parties to get some representation. A lot of European countries have proportional representation. Japan does a little bit differently, and it's done in a way that they have all the seats run, and the parties are, especially in the larger districts, especially in the 23 wards, especially like Setagaya-ku, for example, or Setagaya-ku, Otaku, that had like eight representatives. Each party is only running no more than 2 candidates, so you're going to have multiple parties that win seats. But when you look, if you look at those election returns, Koike's party was at the top in almost every district. If it had been a first past the post system, if that had been a first past the post system, her party would have won almost every seat. every seat. It would have everything. They would have taken almost every single, like 100, and they probably would have won, out of 125 seats or so, they would have won 120. That they would have won everything. That's how it was an absolutely complete sweeping, absolutely sweeping election. The other thing is when you look at the Koike's party. Koike's party had out of the, 45? 55 seats. They won 55 seats. 18 were women. Most of those are new to politics. A number of quite a number of the LDP seats were lost by older male politicians. Older and male. That's a big change. So you have, it's a huge increase in the number of women in the prefectural assembly. That's the kind of thing you see. So what you had was a complete rejection of the leading party, a huge increase in the percentage of women representation, and also a big decrease in age. One of the things that I noticed about this election was when you walked around, when I went around town, I saw a lot of posters where they showed the age. Did you notice that? If you looked at the election posters, a lot of the posters would say how old, that they highlighted how old the person was, and it was like in the early 40s or late 30s, and they really wanted to show you we're young. So that's something I've never seen before. I've never seen before here. And that people emphasizing their youth, because typically here, as you know, age is considered to be, the older and the wisdom and age. Well, they got rid of that. Was a lot of those people lost. So now it's different because this is a different society, and I'm not saying it's the same thing that's going on, but you've seen this pattern all over the world. Really, this is the pattern of people dissatisfied with the status quo, of a dissatisfaction with the status quo in Western countries. Western advanced countries, including Japan and Korea. In that, Korea, of course, just got impeached president, and a new president. As I say, you see with this election, I think this election last Sunday was very important. I think you're going to see, I think Prime Minister Abe is really worried, and I think he's worried about the Koike wants. I think she wants to be prime minister. I think she'll probably will become prime minister at some point. So this is really a global thing. I want to close with this. This is I want you to take a very careful look at this chart. We have enough time to at least introduce it. This shows a percentage of global income distribution. This is a fascinating chart, because if you want to see in one picture the effect of what's going on in the world in the last 25 years, this chart tells you more than any other chart. This is really, really important. This shows you from the lowest income distribution to the highest, each 5% income distribution around the world. And this was done at the household level. So this gentleman, this World Bank economist who did this is great work that was taking household surveys, and they did it at within countries, and was able to break down to a global level the change in income. This shows the real increase in income by each percentile group. Poorest people in the world, and here the richest people in the world, and increase in income going this direction. And you'll see is that, except for these are people in much of Africa, the poorest people in Africa, that hasn't grown. But once you get above that, this is India, say India, Philippines, Southeast Asia, Middle East, some Middle East, lots of China. All a huge increase. This is a big part of the global population. So what you have showing here is 5, 10, 5, 10, 15, 20, 20, 30, 40, 40, 50, 50, 60% of human population benefit. So it's benefit. This is the world, the human population has a total 60% increase. 60% has benefited from this huge, so there really has been an overall human, the globalization, free trade really has benefited the majority of the world's population. So what I'm talking about, when I talk about all of this political unrest is the developed world. This, the middle class, US, Western Europe, Japan, and here, over the last 25 years. Right there. Stagnant. That's here. Stagnant. US, stagnant, even decline. Top 1% of the world population. That's top 1% in Western societies. Making all the gains. So they're gaining like only this tiny bit is gaining like the rest of the world from that. Only this little bit. This is the elite, particularly of the US and Western Europe. And they benefiting a lot too from globalization. Along with this huge mass of humanity, these are all the people. The rest of especially the middle class people of the developed world have been left behind. All that right in that chart. Great chart. Fascinating. Take a close look at that. That's one of the most fascinating charts that you'll see. That tells you a lot. Seeing this, you can tells you a lot about what's going on in the world. So I think next week I might I'm going to talk about India because I'm really I know you're doing some work on China. I might talk a little bit, but I want to be careful about that because I don't want to do, I don't want to steal your work. India, the other thing is that India, what's going on in India is fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. India is going to be, to some extent, to China. And I'm seeing now almost every day in the news something interesting. So I probably will talk about India next week. So please be in touch. Let me know. Start working. You have your hypotheses. You have what you want to work on. Start focusing that on. I'll get all this. They got the actuals. You'll be able to see what I actually did. But let's get going. I think you've got interesting topics. I think you all have some clear ideas in your mind. So I think you're ready to. You're ready to go. So I think you're all in a good position to do some nice work here. So thanks, and we'll look forward to hearing from you with that, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.